The following is a summary of the Sicha of Shabbos Parsha Shelach Tov Shin Nun Aleph. Every Sedra that we read has a certain relationship with the time in the year in which we read it. And every Sedra is a unit of Torah. And in fact, it's a Torah Achas. So every Sedra is a particular Sedra, but part of one whole Torah. And there's a connection of that particular Sedra with the time in which we read it. This is emphasized greatly when you have in one Sedra a story which really spans over most of the Sedra, as in this week's Parsha, in the Parsha of Shelach, when the Torah tells us the story of the spies, and it really goes over most of the Sedra. So you've got one idea in this Sedra as part of an entire Torah in a particular moment of the year. The Haftarah this week is also similar in content to the Sedra. The Sedra tells us of the story of the spies of Moshe, and the Haftarah tells us of the story of the spies that Yehoshua sent. And there are many, many differences between the two. We're going to point out now 6 differences between the sending of the spies of Moshe and the sending of the spies of Yehoshua. And we'll see how that all culminates in a very beautiful lesson which is relevant to this particular time of the year in which we're reading this Sedra. The first difference is Shalach lecha, says Rashi, ledatcha. The spies that Moshe sent, he wasn't commanded by God to send the spies. Rather, God said to him, if you want to send, send from your own free volition. Use your own mind. If you want to send, send. Whereas when it comes to the spies that Yehoshua sent, God instructed him to send those spies. That's difference number 1. Difference number 2, it says that Moshe sent Anoshim v'yosuru es eretz Canaan. They should scout out the land. Whereas Yehoshua, it says he sent meraglim. He sent actually spies to spy out the land. A third difference, Moshe sent 12 men. Yehoshua sent 2. A fourth difference, Moshe sent Nesiei Ha'eda, princes of the congregation. Yehoshua just sent regular men, spies. Number 5, Moshe sent the spies publicly, both in relation to the Jewish people who knew that he was sending those spies, and also in relation to the people of the land. The 12 spies who came into the land didn't make any effort to conceal the fact that they were coming. They didn't hide themselves in any way. And in fact, it says that God had to make a miracle that the inhabitants of the land were so busy in burying their dead that they didn't even notice the spies. That wasn't the case by Yehoshua. He sent them silently, secretly, without any fanfare, both as far as he was concerned and as far as the inhabitants of the land was concerned. And finally, the 6th difference is that the 12 spies of Moshe went la'orka u'la'rachba, the whole length and breadth of the land. It took them 40 days to spy out the whole land, and all 12 of them went right through the entire land. Whereas the spies of Yehoshua, although they were sent into the land, the only place they actually got to was the city of Yericho, of Jericho, and after, in fact, that very night, when they'd been hidden by Rachav, they escaped to the mountains and they came back to the land. So what we need to do is to understand what are the differences between the sending of the spies of Moshe and the sending of the spies of Yehoshua. So the Rabbi explains that in fact there are 2 main reasons why the spies were sent, and this is the main difference between the spies of Moshe and the spies of Yehoshua. The first is, one of the reasons why you send spies is for the need of conquest. Like an army would send spies out in front in order to find out exactly how to enter into the land. That was one reason why spies could be sent. Another reason why spies could be sent is just to know what the land is like. If it's a great land, and if they would come back and give such a report, it would give the people tremendous joy to know that this land is an amazing place to enter into. So when Moshe actually sent out the spies, he knew that the conquest of the land was actually going to take place miraculously. The cloud went before them by day, the pillar of fire by night. So the sending of spies wasn't actually necessary to find how to conquer the land. What was necessary was just to send spies to find out how good the land was. And it was more from the people's perspective that they actually needed to see and hear and feel that goodness of the land. And in fact, that's what the spies actually achieved. They came back and they gave a tremendous report about the land. The problem is that they added something on at the end, and they said that they didn't want to or didn't feel that they could actually conquer or go into the land. Whereas in contrast, the spies of Yehoshua were sent principally to reconnoiter. They were actually sent as, if you want, military spies to find a way how to conquer the land, and therefore they were literally spies. The difference between those two answers all our previous questions. The first question was, and the first difference was, Moshe Rabbeinu sent the spies, L'datcha. Hashem said, I don't think you need to send. If you want to send, send. Because God had already told Moshe and the people that this is a great land. So why did Moshe actually decide to send them in the end? Because he was a leader. He saw the need of the people. The need of the people was to hear from actual people who had seen the land that it was a great land, and then they'd go in joyfully and happily. And so he decided, even though God didn't tell him to do so, he decided to send spies in. Whereas in contrast, that had already been achieved in the days of Yehoshua, because they had already the report which the spies of Moshe had given. What was necessary in the days of Yehoshua was, because the entry into the land was not going to be of such miraculous nature that it was as in the days of Moshe, as it would have been in the days of Moshe, so then it was a more natural entry into land, and therefore he actually needed to send real spies. The second is, Moshe needed to send a representative of all the tribes. And this was simply because each one could come back to their individual tribe and say, wow, I saw this land for my own self, my own eyes saw it's absolutely fantastic. And therefore, because the land actually had not yet been divided up according to the lottery, all 12 spies went through the entire land so that they could all come back with this fantastic report. And also, because the conquest of the land was going to be miraculous, it wasn't necessary for them to conceal themselves, because they knew that this was going to be a miracle, even though Hashem actually did a miracle for them in the sense that he busied the people of the land with burying of the dead. That wasn't the case in the days of Yehoshua, when the spies were sent in on more of a natural level, and they had to act literally like spies. What is astonishing is the result of all this. What happened? Now, the Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah in this week's parsha explains that the spies actually had very noble and spiritual intentions. They didn't want actually to go into a physical land. They wanted to remain in the desert where they would live a detached spiritual existence. They had everything they needed spiritually in the desert. Why should they enter into the land of agriculture and commerce, and a land in which they would have to engage in physical mitzvahs, drawing down the light of the infinite down into the earthly? So that was their intention in remaining in the desert. However, it had disastrous results. Did anything come out good out of what they actually did, or is it all bad? In fact, in reality, on one level, they actually did fulfill their mission, because they did come back and tell the people that the land was flowing with milk and honey. They showed the fruits. They did tell the people it was the bountiful land which they had been promised. And later, 40 years later, the Jewish people relied on that evidence and would actually go into the land happily because they knew already that it was in fact a fantastic land. But even more than that, Rashi says when they actually went out, they were actually kosher. The Rebbe's father points out that the word kasher is the Rosh Tevis of the words in Tehillim, Kamoitze Shalal Rav, like one who finds a great spoil. Because the beginning, if you want, of the entry into the land was in fact sealed by these spies. Although they themselves and the generation remained in the desert, what they had implanted in the people is that it was in fact a great land, and ultimately when the Jewish people would go in, they would start this elevation, if you want, of the world from its lowest levels, from the earth and upwards. And that's why there's this difference between the 12 spies of Moshe and the 2 spies of Yehoshua. 12 is the idea of all the different Shavatim, all the different tribes. Now, each tribe had a portion in the land, and in fact that portion in the land was very appropriate to what the spiritual service of that particular tribe was. And consequently, each one had to report back about their portion. But we find in the Sedra that all of them went to every portion, which indicated this beautiful idea that because of their Avos Yisrael and their Achdus, their unity, they all were worried for each other. They all saw each other's portion. So if you want, we have this concept that although there's going to be the division of the land in 12, but nevertheless, there's this unified purpose. And the Rebbe in the Sicha now is going to bring out the 2 concepts of hischalkus, division, and unified purpose. And he says that it's actually very related to the time in the year in which we are reading the Sedra, which is the end of the month of Sivan, the month in which the Torah was given. In the Torah, there are 600,000 letters, corresponding to 600,000 Jewish souls. Each letter has to be surrounded by parchment, an individual letter. And yet, if one letter is missing, the whole Torah is invalid. All must be together. So there's the concept of division, of having separate letters, but then there's the concept of all of them being together, making one unit. In general, you could look at that, that's the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. There is one Torah, which has inside it 613 mitzvahs. Similarly, in the Jewish people, you have one general soul, which is the source root of all souls as they coalesce in the national Jewish soul. And then there are souls as they descend each into individual bodies and have individual missions and purposes. And these 2 are expressed in the 12 spies of Moshe and the 2 spies of Yehoshua. The 12 spies of Moshe are the idea of division, each tribe having separate work. It was sent by Moshe from his own volition because he had to use his mind and his own division of soul powers in order to work this out. Whereas in contrast, the sending of the 2 spies of Yehoshua was sent because Hashem told him to do that, and it was an act of Kabbalas Ol, of accepting upon himself the yoke of heaven, just 2 of them, like the division in mitzvahs, the do's and the don'ts, the ases and the los ases. This is the idea of that which transcends division. Who were the 2 spies that Yehoshua sent? Kalev and Pinchas. Kalev was in fact one of the spies that was in the original group of Moshe. Pinchas was a man from the tribe of Levi. Now, the tribe of Levi didn't even get a portion in the land. So why was he sent in? The answer is, it says when Mashiach will come, the land will in fact be divided into 13 portions, and Levi will also actually get a portion in the land. And the reason is because nowadays it's necessary to have a separate, or Levi separated off, because they need to inspire the people, whereas when Mashiach comes, when the whole world will be full of the knowledge of God, then it won't be necessary for Levi to, if you want to be separate, and they will get an actual portion of the land. And therefore, those two, both Kalev and Pinchas, represent the ideas. On the one hand, there needs to be the division, and at the same time, there needs to be the coalescing into the unified whole. We find the exact same idea at the end of the Sedra in the Parsha of Tzitzis. Tzitzis is one mitzvah, but it reminds us of all the 613 mitzvahs. The numerical value of the word tzitzis is 600, with the 8 strands and the 5 knots, it's 613. Ure'isa moise, we see the tzitzis, uzachartem, when we remember all the mitzvahs. Again, it's the idea of one mitzvah, and yet all the 613. Division and unity together. And there's a very powerful lesson in this, and that is that even though we are a nation of different people, ein deyosehem shaves, people have different minds, have different mindsets, have different missions, have different purposes, and so on and so forth. However, we need to also look at the people as how they are coalesced as a single unit. That starts off in the morning when we say, before davening, Hareini mekabel alai mitzvahs haseh shel v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, taking upon ourselves the love of our fellow. And similarly, as we move through the day, everything we should do should not just be for ourselves, but we should also incorporate the other. So, for example, giving tzedakah in the merits of another person, learning Torah with another person, raising many students. When we learn Rambam, in fact, this is exemplified in the collection of the entire Torah, which is learnt in halacha form by ourselves, one Torah. And certainly, when it comes to the pnimius of the Torah, the soul level of Torah, learning Chassidus, which in fact took on a completely new dimension on the 28th of Sivan. And that year, Nun Aleph, was the 50th year after the Rebbe had arrived in America, a jubilee of a new release of energy and outreach and spreading of the well springs outwards. That took on a completely new level on that year. And therefore, to summarize, we have in this one Sedra something which relates to this particular time of the year at the end of the month of Sivan. When we're culminating the giving of the Torah, what we need to know is, yes, it's one Torah, yes, it divides, but within that division, we need to see the coalesced whole. We need to see the achdus, both within the people, within the Torah, and within the mitzvahs. And we hope that, as it says in this week's Sedra, that the Torah tells us of our eventual entry into the land, although we had the calamity of the spies in this week's Sedra, but nevertheless the Torah does tell us that we will eventually get into the land. So it should be for us. We should eventually get into a complete land, not returning any territories that have been given to us by God, but having a complete land of Israel. And then we will merit that this land will be divided amongst the 13 tribes, and we will go into the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, and bring a korban todah, a sacrifice, an offering of thanksgiving to Hashem, receive the new Torah of Mashiach, and that should all happen, B'Karav Mamish, very speedily in our days. Amen.